This is an ACU Centre for Liturgy podcast. Speaking of liturgy. Have you ever wondered about the process of translating the Church's Latin liturgical texts into English? Speaking of liturgy, Father Andrew Menke, the Executive Director of the International Commission for English in the Liturgy, also known as ICEL, outlines the work of ICEL undertaken on behalf of the English-speaking conferences of bishops around the world, and some of the steps involved in translating Latin texts into English.
Have you ever wondered about the origin of the prayers we use in the Catholic liturgy? Perhaps you know that most of them were first written in Latin. But how do they make their way into the English liturgies we celebrate in our parishes? This translation work is a primary mission of ICEL, the International Commission on English in the Liturgy. ICEL is a mixed commission, meaning that it's a joint project of Catholic bishops from all over the world, from countries where English is used in the celebration of the sacred liturgy. It might be helpful to begin with some background information to put this topic into context. Liturgical books are the texts used for the Catholic Church's liturgical prayer, the official prayer of the Church, usually prayed as a community. This would include texts for the Mass and the celebration of the other sacraments, the praying of the Liturgy of the Hours, and the celebration of certain sacramentals, such as blessings. Liturgical prayer is not the only kind of prayer, of course, but it's an important part of the spiritual life alongside our own personal prayer. These liturgical books are produced first by the Vatican, and they're issued in Latin. For over 1,000 years, liturgical prayer in the Catholic Church was done almost exclusively in Latin. However, at the Second Vatican Council, which met from 1962 to 1965, the bishops decided to open the door to celebrating our liturgical prayer in other languages, or in the vernacular, and not only in Latin. Consequently, this decision created a new task for the bishops of the world. Whenever the Vatican issues a liturgical text in Latin, the bishops now have the responsibility to see to it that the text is translated into the language spoken by their people. As we know, some languages are more or less confined to a particular region of the world, but other languages are more widespread. Think, for example, of Spanish or French or Arabic, and how many people in different countries speak these languages. English has a worldwide reach. Millions of people speak it as a first language, and perhaps 1 billion speak it as a second language. When it comes to languages that are spoken in multiple countries, the Vatican has encouraged the bishops of those countries to collaborate in the work of liturgical translation. This kind of collaboration among nations is a matter of good stewardship of resources, since it would be silly for different teams in various countries to be doing the same translation work. So soon after the start of the Second Vatican Council, bishops from English-speaking countries could already see the writing on the wall. They knew that vernacular translations were going to become a part of the Church's liturgical prayer. So the bishops of 11 countries, with sizable populations of English-speaking Catholics, agreed to form the International Commission on English in the Liturgy, or ICEL. The bishops of each member country choose one bishop to send as their representative to the commission, and these 11 bishops constitute the board of directors of the organization. These bishops of ICEL also have a small staff of employees to assist them in their work. These days, ICEL tends to do 3 kinds of translation projects. First, now and then the Vatican releases a new liturgical text that needs to be translated from Latin into English. For example, in 2021, the Pope declared 3 saints to be doctors of the Church and added them to the liturgical calendar: St. Gregory of Narek, St. John of Avila, and St. Hildegard of Bingen. ICEL prepared English translations for the prayers for those celebrations, and they should be coming into use soon. A second kind of project that ICEL undertakes these days is the translation of some of the few liturgical texts that were never officially translated into English for one reason or another. In recent years, this has included the hymns of the Liturgy of the Hours, nearly 300 of them. Another project in this category is the Roman Martyrology, a large book with a listing and brief biography of most of the canonized saints of the Church, organized according to their feast days. At the moment, ICEL is putting the finishing touches on its work on the martyrology. Finally, a third kind of ICEL project is the review and possible retranslation of texts that were first translated into English soon after the Second Vatican Council. Some of those early translations had a tendency to paraphrase, partly because this was a new task for the Church, and partly because there was a great hurry to get the vernacular texts published. The Vatican subsequently indicated that the translations of Latin liturgical books needed to be more accurate, so ICEL has systematically been reviewing the liturgical books. Currently, ICEL is finishing a new translation of the Liturgy of the Hours, and we're in the midst of reviewing material used in the lectionary, and we plan to begin looking at the Book of Blessings in the near future. For all these three kinds of projects, ICEL begins by choosing a person or a team of persons with expertise in both Latin and liturgical prayer, who will prepare a first translation of the text. Then a committee of bishops and other experts will review that base translation and make any adjustments they deem necessary. After that, the text comes to the 11 bishops who form the ICEL Commission, and they review the text and make any changes they feel are necessary. Once they approve the text, it's sent to the 11 bishops' conferences for review. All the bishops of those conferences then have the opportunity, individually and in consultation with their own advisors, to make suggestions for improving the text. Once that review period is finished, the bishops of ICEL study the suggestions and make their final changes to the text. Finally, at the end of this process, ICEL sends the text to its member conferences, and ICEL's work on the project is completed. At that point, it's up to the local bishops to decide what to do with ICEL's translation. Sometimes the bishops of a country will decide to make even further changes to ICEL's text, perhaps to account for local variations in English, for example. Once the bishops of a country have a text they're happy with, they send it off to the Holy See for approval for liturgical use. Under the current Vatican legislation, if the bishops of a country say that their vernacular translation is good, then the Holy See should more or less take their word for it, and the Vatican then confirms the text for liturgical use. They use the Latin word confirmatio to describe that approval. But if the bishops of a country want to introduce any significant modifications or changes to a Latin text of the Roman Rite, then the bar for approval is a little higher, and the Holy See studies the matter more closely. If the Vatican agrees to this kind of proposal, the approval is called a recognitio, or the recognition that the ritual is appropriate for Catholic liturgy. For example, recently the bishops of Australia approved a special form of the Mass for use in certain Aboriginal communities. The bishops of Australia will now work with the Vatican to try to obtain the recognitio for this special form of liturgical celebration. At the end of this long process, once the bishops obtain Rome's approval of a liturgical text, they can arrange for its publication, and then their priests and people can begin using it in the sacred liturgy. So by way of summary, ICEL's role in this process is to be of assistance to the English-speaking bishops of the world in a collaborative work of translation. ICEL certainly doesn't replace the authority of the local bishops, but rather serves the Church by proposing English translations of liturgical texts that the bishops can then use as they see fit. The actual approval and use of these texts is a matter that's between the local bishops and the Vatican. I should conclude by observing that this work of liturgical translation is still relatively new in the life of the Church. It's only a little over 50 years since the end of the Second Vatican Council, which for me is a lifetime, but which isn't a very long time in the history of the Catholic Church. So the question of what liturgical translations should sound like is still a little tricky, and good people will have different opinions about this issue. Some would prefer liturgical texts to sound more like ordinary conversation, while others would prefer liturgical texts to sound more formal and elevated. The bishops are still feeling their way forward in this important question, and will probably continue to do so for some time. The end goal of all this work, of course, is to give worthy praise and thanksgiving to Almighty God and to assist in the sanctification of souls. In its own way, ICEL hopes to contribute to these objectives. May God bless you.
That was Father Andrew Menke, the Executive Director of the International Commission for English in the Liturgy, outlining the process of translating Latin texts into English. The ACU Centre for Liturgy, which provides pastoral formation in liturgy across Australia and beyond, is pleased to provide this podcast, Speaking of Liturgy.